I think I was first aware of ash really as a kid. My dad taught me what an ash tree looked like. We had one in the garden. Its leaves and its bark. And from his point of view, and the teaching was really that it was really good firewood. Because it was easy to split, lovely straight grain. So you hit it with the axe, it pings off. It's just such a good material. You know, and I think it's really important with all natural resources that we use them for the best. You know, get the best out of them. Different timbers have different attributes, you know, different characteristics that make them useful for one thing and not particularly good for another. Ash is really, really good for making handles, for making thin things that are strong. There's an incredible amount of strength along the grain, and it won't shatter. It'll have a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of give. All the things that ash is really good at are good at those things because of those attributes. Wherever ash grew, it was an ash handle, because people understood that this thing was, it gave you mechanical advantage, but it was flexible, so it didn't shock the arm when you hit something against it. And that, it unleashed our imagination. Pretty much anything that needed a handle had an ash handle. It's important to remember that the best buildings, the buildings that we all think are really famous, like cathedrals and castles and things like this, they may have structures made of great big oak beams, and they last till this day. But what strikes me is that they wouldn't have been possible, they wouldn't have been built without tens and tens of thousands even of tools with ash handles. You know, they don't survive to this day perhaps, but I think we need to really acknowledge the fact that we couldn't build the things that we did, galleons, castles, cathedrals, without ash-handled tools. I find it quite fascinating that across the entire sort of natural growing range of ash, you've got all these cultures that lived independently of each other. Sure, they might have brushed up against each other here and there, but they all these different cultures have their own version of essentially the same story. The Norse people considered the ash the tree of life. They held it in such reverence that in their storytelling, the ash tree held up the entire world. And the first man came from the ash, he was born from the ash. In Celtic mythology, the ash symbolizes strength, power, rejuvenation, you know, these really powerful messages. And the similarity between these sort of disparate cultures, but they, you know, the storytelling is very similar. It's not a coincidence. It's not just storytelling, but it's education, you know, it's passing on information. It's telling the kids, this is an ash tree, it's really important because it's going to help you in your entire life. And that sort of level of storytelling across, you know, multiple generations all over a huge chunk of the world, revering this stuff, I think is really, really powerful. And I think back now of my dad teaching me how to use an axe, how to identify an ash tree, and I think, well, that's really lovely. That's like a really, really small scale version of this, you know, teaching on a huge scale that used to happen, you know, in the fjords and inlets of Norway and you know, across Scotland and Ireland and the whole of Europe, the whole of the growing range of ash. Different stories that tell exactly the same thing. It's funny because every day I work in the workshop, I have my hand on a piece of ash, and sometimes I don't even consider it, but I've got chisels with ash handles and saws with ash handles. My mallet that I use for every single chisel strike that I ever do is an ash-handled hammer. So even without thinking about it, my connection with ash is really strong. Hearing about the threat to ash, I sort of thought, I want to look into this a bit more. I want to know whether we should be making lots and lots of things out of ash, or maybe we shouldn't make anything out of ash. But, really to find out what it is that's happening with the species, and to see if there's something that, as a furniture maker, I could do to help the situation, or to, I don't know, just gain knowledge, just learn a bit more. When you consider the importance that ash has been to us all, I think it's doubly important. We really need to relearn about ash, its history, its importance through the ages, how beautiful it is, and then, we owe it to ash to find out how we can help it in its sort of darkest hour, so to speak.
I'm an ecologist and I've been working on woodland biodiversity for quite a number of years. And my specialism is protected species. So that's all species that use woodlands, not just the trees. So all the invertebrates, all the mammals, all the plants that grow there. So anything that's rare and protected, I have to think about and try and increase the evidence base for policy and practice to manage those woodlands better for those protected species.
I got into forestry completely by accident almost, in that I left school, or was poised to leave school, not really knowing what I wanted to do. And I kind of was vaguely into biology and being outside. And my driving instructor at the time, when I was 17 learning to drive, it actually turned out his brother was a forester. And so he suggested that I look into forestry as a potential career for restless, outdoor liking people. And the way he sold it to me was, you might never be rich, but you might be happy. So that appealed quite a lot at the time. I think most forestry people find that their career in life become very intertwined because it's so vocational. They don't say, oh, I work in forestry. They're like, I am a forester. It's a bit like, I suppose, everybody needs their own tribe, and I think forestry, a bit like farming, has quite a strong sort of tribe. You know, you find your people kind of thing.
example is that the chairs that are on top of each other there, although it's meant to go one way, actually when you turn it the other way, it looks like a different piece of furniture. So we're kind of thinking, actually, what else could we do with this? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, and I think that's one of the. I mean, that's partly why I never chuck things away. You see all the bits around because you see bends and you think, that might be useful for something, or we could use that bend for something, or we could develop that idea into something else, really. And then we have a workshop clustered full of bits of wood. When I first started, I was an industrial designer, and I sort of started doing that, really. And then craft became a main interest, really, and actually learning the skills of fine woodworking, really, and working with wood, really. But at that stage, I was always looking for the best timber we could get, and the best timber we could get was usually French, actually, or came from the Baltic states at the time, particularly with oak, really. And it wasn't until we got involved with our woodland here in Aberfeldy, really, that I started thinking more about the use of local timber.
I grew up in the far west of Scotland, in a very windswept part of the country, so there weren't very many trees. Trees were a novelty. But my grandfather had some spruce on a banking to stop the bank eroding, and it was just, I remember really quite vividly when the shoot was expanding in the spring and the little bud scales were just being shed, and there was just an amazing spiral of these little young leaves in a pale green spiral. It was just the symmetry of it was I don't know what age I was there, probably about 8 or something, and it stuck with me all these years. I still, at a particular time of year, find myself going along just easing off the bud scales to see that little spiral of new needles.
Won't take me for granted as time marches on.
Shinty sticks and hockey sticks used to be made of ash, but they're not anymore. They're made of hickory from the States. Hickory is a really good wood, you know, and it's the same with tool handles. You buy a hammer these days, it was probably fiberglass or aluminium shafted or something like this. If it is wood, it's probably hickory. But we should start using ash again, because ash was the best. You know, that was the material that we used to get where we are now. So we should use it again. And we have it in abundance, so we should definitely make the most of it. And that potential, we all need to realise that potential. Everyone in the supply chain.
Ash is really sort of unusually vigorous for a hardwood tree, and its timber is valuable. You know, furniture-grade timber is a very attractive species to grow.
It has a fast growth rate, has a nice white timber.
Ash is a very important timber. It's a very undervalued timber here and has been for a long time.
So I'm told that it's very amenable to steam bending.
There's nothing that can do ash like ash.
Ash is one of the best woods for bending with, really, and I really like it as a material. It gives quite a different sort of character to the wood as well.
You have this additional set of uses for some more specialised niche markets.
And ash is very special in that it supports a whole range of different ground flora.
It fulfills useful ecological niches that not many other species do.
So we think there are about 955 different species that are supported by ash. 45 of those are only known to be associated with ash, and a number of those species are actually quite rare already.
I could probably convincingly argue that ash is the most important material to mankind, let alone of the timbers.
You know, we take ash trees so much for granted, really, that I think it won't be till they've gone that people will even notice them, really, in which case it's too late, really.
It's only when things start going wrong that you really notice things are changing, that there is an issue.
It's very sad that what we think of as an ash elm woodland may not really exist in any great capacity.
Unfortunately, now you can increasingly spot ashes from a distance because of ash dieback. You can see the sort of dead, deformed wood in the crown, so quite possible to spot it once you know what you're looking at from a distance.
Well, if ash disappears, then those species no longer have anything to live on, and that's a big concern. So they're very much threatened with the decline and loss of ash in the landscape. There's a couple of moth species that actually bore into the buds of the ash tree, and those are thought to be only using ash trees and no other species. So if ash disappears, then that's quite serious for those two moth species, and that's a big concern. That's only quite a small percentage of all the species that are supported by ash trees. All the rest use other trees often as a host or something to eat or live on, or that supports them. So it's really important to understand what other tree species are needed by these species that use ash to be able to ensure that they continue and are supported and conserved into the future.
Ash dieback is caused by a fungus, Hymenociphes fraxinea. The fungus itself is native to Far East, Japan, Korea, and there it's co-evolved with the ash species there and doesn't cause significant damage. But as it's come east through mainland Europe, it became clear that our common ash, Fraxinus excelsior, was not resistant and was being affected. What happens is the fungi usually infect the leaf first, and then it can spread back down through the leaf into the twigs and the branch and progressively into the stem. And if the full circumference of the living tissue is affected, then the upper part of the tree no longer can access water and nutrients, so it dies. The mortality rates could be up to 98%. The tree will resprout from below the point of damage, but then you have a really distorted, nasty-looking tree with very limited growth rate. So it's spread, the spores develop on the infected leaves once they've fallen off, and overwintered on the ground, and the following spring and summer the little fruiting bodies will be produced, and the spores from these fruiting bodies then are dispersed on the wind and can affect trees at some distance, usually downwind of the prevailing wind direction.
So it's very, very sad, and also, a lot of good plantations of ash were planted with the view of producing timber, and it's very unclear whether they will come to fruition. It seems unlikely that they'll be able to produce a good timber crop for the people that invested in planting them. It's puzzling because you'll see a tree that is in pretty much full canopy right next to a tree that is dead or is, on borrowed time. So I can't say that there's any strong correlation between where I see it and where I don't. It seems to be the tree's own genetic or circumstance capacity is what keeps them safe.
Well, I think in time there will be some sort of level of resistance developed, but that's going to take decades. And in the meantime, I think we need to be thinking about alternative species to be using to give the ash time to develop that level of resistance that would make it worth, deliberately planting at scale in Scotland.
Sycamore is not a native species, but it has been in this country for a very long time. And our research shows, or we believe, that the sycamore supports about half of the species that the ash tree supports. So it's a very good species to have in your woodland, along with other broadleaf tree species to help support all those species that ash supports currently, but may not in the future if it disappears from our woodlands.
Everyone has a journey with whatever material they're using, and I think my journey with ash, like I say, it's not the most common material for me to use, but I think because of hearing about ash dieback, going back sort of 5 or 6 years really, I started hearing about this in the news, or fellow furniture makers or sawmillers would talk about it, and so I started looking into it a little bit and finding out what it meant, and like knowing kind of almost in the back of my head, but knowing how good ash is as a material, thinking, what is going to happen here, and we've had experience because Dutch elm disease decimated the population of elm trees, and elm is, possibly my favourite material, or one of the materials I use most, and it's getting quite hard to get hold of elm bores now because the trees are gone. There's no mature elm trees around, and so it's sort of the supply chain there is sort of drying up, and I really worried that would happen with ash. So I sort of wanted to find out a little bit more about it. I wanted to start using it a bit more, and find out what was going on. I had this real fear that, the first few articles that I read sort of indicated to me that perhaps all the ash trees in the landscape were going to go. Everything was going to either fall down or be chopped down. So my initial thought was we as furniture makers, we should be really looking at what we can do to use all the ash. And I think having having spoken to people in forestry and and sawmillers and I guess just spent some time thinking about it and reading about it, that's probably not the case. It's probably not as doom and gloom as I once thought.
So I do fear slightly that the economic imperative will be to clear ash before it becomes unutilisable, which I understand, but equally the trees that exist now, as I say, they might hold the code to resistance. So I hope that some people leave some ash in the landscape where it's not threatening infrastructure and everything else. And then I hope that ultimately we see a population respond from that resistant refuge, if you like. And I don't think that it'll be something I see in my lifetime, but I hope that's something that future generations, that the way we've experienced elm now is a rarity in the landscape. I hope that there'll come a time when people don't feel that way about ash.
It'll be quite a few decades before I think we'll see it coming back, but I do have hope that it will recover. There's an awful lot of diversity, genetic diversity within our native tree species. So we're hopefully, if they can regenerate enough and get enough chances to grow and set seed and regrow and set seed, then we might get the ash back into our woodlands that way.
With each species that we don't plant or is affected by disease, we just have a less resilient woodland and a less resilient forest.
Do they just turn it into firewood, or do they look for a local sawmiller? Do they maybe, establish a local sawmill? Those sawmillers and the furniture makers nearby should be talking to each other, and then hopefully that will, mean that more things are made with ash, and that hopefully more people buy it. Because actually the colour, the shade forest that I'm sitting on is mostly made of ash, and it's this really lovely blonde wood that a lot of people really like. Blonde wood. A lot of people buy a lot of birch plywood furniture made in Scandinavia, and it's a real kind of trend, and I don't really see a huge amount of difference in using Scottish ash than that sort of trend for blonde wood. It's beautiful. It's really straight grained. It works really well. Makes these amazing curls. It's a pleasure to use, really. And I think that's the thing. I think I would really like to see the trees that have to come down being used for something good. I would just really hope that the trees that do need to come down, and we do know that a lot will need to come down because there are an awful lot of ash trees in parklands and farmlands, over roads. There's a really sickly ash here. Almost no leaves left on the crown. Railways, public areas, these trees will become dangerous because the timber becomes brittle, they'll come down in the wind, bits will fall off, damaged property. So they will need to come down, and an awful lot of those trees are really big trees, really good trees for making furniture with. We're the world's second biggest importer of timber, which is a bit of an outrage, really, because we're surrounded by trees. Trees that are an important habitat, but they're also a crop. And if we use these things sensibly, everyone benefits. The whole ecosystem, if you like, of forestry can benefit. So that's what I'd like to see. And I think, from meeting people and talking to people about ash, I'm not the only one. I mean, like everyone I've spoken to wants to see the same thing. The sawmillers want to see, a better network of sawmills. The foresters want more sawmills so they can sell their wood locally. Furniture makers want to make furniture with wood that's grown locally. And consumers, certainly my customers, they love the story. If you can tell them exactly where the timber came from, show them the stump or whatever, then that's the story that they really relish, you know, and that, you know, that the table or the chair or whatever it is takes on new meaning. And that's really wonderful. And today, in this sort of throwaway, instant consumer society, that's quite rare. But it almost shouldn't be rare because it seems to be what everyone wants. I don't think anyone really likes chopping trees down. You know, certainly trees of the, you know, this sort of stature, these great big giants of the countryside. To see one of these trees being chopped down, it's quite lamentful. You know, it's not an enjoyable thing to see. You do feel a sort of sense of loss when it hits the deck. You know, there's that sort of anticipation that everything's happening and, you know, all the gear's going and the chainsaws are going, and then...
Okay, you ready? You give it a pull. Oh, what a bit of wood. Lovely bit of wood.
It's quite sad. You know, this is something that's been around for a couple of hundred years. It's witnessed all sorts of things quietly, without, you know, without showing opinion. It just observes, and then it's done. It's, you know, it's on the ground and it's down, and that's a shame. And it's not actually until you then start the next process, if you like, the milling, that you start to sort of see the potential.
So I started off as a designer. I have a degree in industrial design. I started off designing potties and pushchairs, the likes of Mothercare and things in London. And then I did a course in cabinet making about 6 years after that to teach them the art of working with wood. That sort of led on to the craftsmanship, really. And I then became kind of infatuated with the craftsmanship and, learning the skills of making furniture really to the best of my ability, really, sort of doing everything as well as you possibly could, really.
Okay.
And at that stage, the wood that we used was very much just a material. So I sort of thought that I would just buy the material as I needed it, and the design and the craft were really the main things I was interested in. But when we moved up to Aberfeldy, we got involved in buying a woodland with some other foresters, really. And that kind of reinvigorated my practice and brought the wood more into what we do, really. So the last 15, 16 years that we've had the wood itself has become that much more important to the practice and how we work, really. So we now use almost exclusively wood that has come from about a 40-mile radius, some from our own woodland, and also quite a lot from local estates. And that wood has kind of influenced our practice over the years, really.
I think one of the other things that was really interesting coming here was when you first came, you thought that you couldn't use this wood for furniture making because it's so different to what would be considered commercial grade timber. And it took quite a long time to develop these steam bending processes. And also I remember we used to look at the wood and we were kind of almost quite worried that people would not like it. Yeah. But what's happened is a lot of people who are interested in your furniture actually love that the wood comes from Perthshire.
Well,
and there's a real strong sense of place. And that's probably the trick, isn't it? To find what it is in your actual place that makes it unique.
We try and make things that will last. I mean, we consciously make everything as well as we can, thinking that it's going to last hundreds of years, really. Sort of there will be, things in the future that people will look at and it'll still be functional and it'll still be there, really. That's how I perceive the work that we make, really, sort of. So not as a short-term stylish or a fashionable thing that might be not fashionable in the next 5 years or something, really. We're making things with a longer vision.
There's different provenances. These are all all the oaks are from different places.
Yes, I see some are Scottish, some are Swedish.
Yes.
Danish, yes.
It's a big European experiment.
There are some obvious differences already.
Yes, it's usually quite marked. You can usually see the genetic differences straight away. A lot of it's to do with the altitude that they come from and whether they've got a long or a short growth period.
Yeah. So this, in a way, it's a bit like the big mass screening experiment we did with ash. Do you remember?
Yes.
In 2012, was it? We got, in the end, you know, we got 155,000 plants from 14 different provenances, and they were planted out on 11 sites. Do you remember this scramble we had to
Very
find
much so, yes.
the 11 sites? So these trials have been going for quite a long time now, and each year fewer ash have survived and fewer completely healthy trees, but there are a very small number of trees that do seem to be more resistant. There are lots of follow-on experiments that seem to be suggesting that there is a genetic basis for the resistance. So, you know, there are good options for selecting and breeding
Yes.
ash that are resistant to Killearn.
Lots of people really revere oak as being a great hardwood, and you know, most of my customers actually, if someone wants to buy a table, they tend to say, "Oh, I'd like an oak table," which is fine. It's a great material, but so it's really well known as being a good wood. And if the oaks started to die, you know, like, it would be outcry, and rightly so. But it's slightly less so for ash. But is that right? You know, I somehow don't think it is. I think we all, you know, all trees are equal, and they should really be cherished as such.
So I mean, like, hardwoods do have value, but a lot of their value is, or a lot of what they go for is fuel wood for the most part, because there tends to be an economy of scale of you harvest. The quality is often middling at best because we haven't necessarily managed these stands as well as we could have. So it's often easier for a grower of these trees to send them into a simple fuel wood market and to try and deal with several customers that want small amounts of that parcel. Sort of increases the labour, if you like, in selling that parcel. So it takes somebody to decide that the best use for this is something else and to bear the cost of doing the extra effort for that. So although they have a value, it's actually somewhat limited. The conifers, we can sell them quite easily. So, you know, you can grow conifers in the same time period as 2 rotations of conifers for 1 of hardwood, and you could make a lot more money doing softwood at the current market conditions. But that's partly because we haven't managed them to their maximum benefit. So hopefully this time around, we'll be able to manage these hardwood trees as best as possible and give them the best chance of being a high value product.
Half of the trees in Scotland were planted in the last 50 years. It's a crop, and it should be managed as such, treated as such, given the respect it deserves as a crop, and then be used for the best long-term use possible.
The decline in the smaller sawmill has been a really negative thing for, like, niche products, I suppose. You know, most of our markets are going to larger centralised sawmills, or a lot of Scottish hardwood has traditionally been exported to England, and with that a lot of the value gets exported as well. And the cost of haulage to faraway places erodes the value of the timber. So if we had more diversity of users and makers close to home, then it would really change things quite substantially.
Foresters need to, you know, when they've got ash trees that need to come out, they need to be speaking to sawmillers, local sawmillers. Hopefully that will encourage more people to open sawmills or to start little businesses. You know, you don't have to go back too many years and there would have been a sawmill in every parish across Scotland. And now it's really rare. You know, there are a couple of little sawmills operating, but if you needed to build a fence 100 years ago, you'd go to, you know, a sawmill 5 miles down the road.
If we could get back to having more of a local supply chain, really, And that involves, to a certain extent, there's quite a lot of politics involved with that as well, because of land use and land ownership, really, sort of. So it touches on that as well. But, we are very lucky to have this bit of woodland turret that we co-own, that we can use to do that, really. And I think, if that could be recycled, that model where people looked after wood, used the wood, and made beautiful things with the wood, then that would be a fantastic thing.
So in our practice, in our workshop, provenance is king. So even more important, I would say, than the sort of specific design. Our furniture is based on traditional vernacular styles, farmhouse furniture. But we use local Scottish wood. It's full of shakes, full of cracks, full of character. I really like that. But one thing that our furniture does allow us to do is, in some cases actually, take consumers back to the stump. There's a real connection from woodland all the way through to workshop. And I think that, in a nutshell, is possibly the message that I would want to get across, that can be done. It is being done, and it could be done a bit more. Of course, it's an incredibly short period of time that we have in the workshop with that material. I've got this habit of counting rings. Probably quite a lot of furniture makers count rings from time to time. A big board of wood will come in. We'll be making a table, and I'll count the rings back and say, I could be working on an oak table. The material's 250 years old, and that's quite incredible. So if you look back, you'll do a little Google search or whatever, and 200 years ago, think what was happening in the world, and the tree was a sapling at that time. That's quite staggering that we're using material that actually is that old. It's slow life. There's something really lovely about having that tiny little moment in the lifespan of the material where it's ours to look after and to do the right thing by, hopefully, so it can move on to a customer and be cherished, passed on through generations. And I think it's a really special thing that furniture makers can do. Makers of other things too, of course, sculptors and all the rest of it, but for me as a furniture maker, that's what makes it really personal.
Having been independent for the last 3 years, it's given me a lot more opportunity to focus on these different types of silviculture, growing different trees, which I guess most foresters, I think, if they had the luxury of that, they would want to grow lots of different trees for lots of different purposes. So I guess that's probably how things have evolved. And in a wider sense, the risks from climate change and pests and diseases seem to have featured much more severely, which obviously is pertinent to ash dieback, but we have a number of other commercial species that are susceptible or potentially becoming susceptible to pests and diseases or the changes that we get with climate change. So our focus on having to mix things up and to build a bit of resilience, is the word that everybody uses, into the system is something that's catching a lot more focus than it did previously.
Well, with research, you're just doing a little bit. It's always a small bit, adding a little bit of evidence to the growing extent of knowledge. So it's always quite small steps, I feel like we're making. But you always look back. You should always look back across all the research that's happened. So there's that sense of always looking back, seeing what other people have done, what other knowledge is out there, and then trying to take small steps into the future.
People seem to be very sort of obsessed with what they can see at their eye level and don't understand how much is going on in the top of the trees and under the ground. And there are these extra dimensions in a woodland that you need to think about. And you get so much more pleasure if you can understand that, what is in the canopy and up in that space that you're not really occupying, and also what's under the ground.
If we could just save a few of these trees from being chipped and turn them into something useful, then we've won. That's a marvelous thing. A tree can be 150, 200 years old. The sort of life of that tree, the things that it's witnessed over time, it's quite incredible. Some of these things can be read in the grain within the wood. When you open up a board at a sawmill, you see these grains, the patterns, the lines. They're there for a reason. That's because of weather, turmoil or whatever it is that's been faced by that tree. And we just see it as patterns and loveliness, and that's what makes the tables unique. And then we can then turn that into a table to make new stories. You know, I think that the power of a table, people say the kitchen is the heart of the home, but I think actually the heart of the kitchen is even more important than that. You can't have a kitchen without a table, but it will witness all the sort of stories and the history being made of that family, you know, homework being done as kids, arguments, you know, happy times, you know, fantastic meals, Christmas dinners, anniversaries, whatever it is, you know, and then that table can be passed on through generations. That sort of future history that we can afford a tree, that's a real power that I think, if you like, it's the special power of a furniture maker. And I think that is a really, I think about it a lot when I'm making furniture, that sort of forward life that we can give a tree is in everything we do.
For I've looked down on all of your glories, all of your fights and fortunes and tears.
So making this little chair for a child really has been it's been quite interesting, because I set out to make something entirely by hand, using only hand tools, trying to kind of emulate or recreate how a chair might have been made somewhere like this, somewhere, you know, rurally in Scotland 150 years ago, when, you know, if a family was growing, you know, a new child came along and they didn't have enough chairs, so somebody needed to make a chair. So they didn't necessarily go to a furniture maker. They just used what they had to hand. You know, simple, a bough of a tree, chop it down, split it up, shave it up, turn it into a chair. There's not an awful lot of thought beyond that has gone into it, but it works. I mean, it's a chair, you can sit on it. I think I quite like doing that, quite like the immediacy of making something without really designing it to begin with, just having a vague idea in my head how it will look, and the proportions sort of work their way out as you go. And that was particularly nice with this, because I really wanted to, I suppose, you know, furniture makers always have a connection with the material, but there's a particular connection when you're just using hand tools. Get them really sharp, hold them stably in your vise, or in this case, the shave horse, and just let the blade cut through the material. That feeling as you sort of glide over and through the fibres, it's really quite special. And I think more people should do it. I mean, people, even non-furniture makers, should find themselves a way of getting on a course or something and making something like this, because actually it's immensely satisfying. The feeling of sharp tool on wood, the smells and the sounds, these are things that are really special. And buying a chair simply doesn't achieve that. So I've really enjoyed making it as a, you know, getting a better direct connection with the wood, and particularly now, you know, working with ash on this project, on this little chair, has been nice, because I've been thinking a lot about ash recently because of dieback and the sort of the deep dive of research and exploration that I've been going through personally into this material. And so I've been making more things with ash in my workshop, using the power tools, using the sort of hybrid method that we adopt here. But all the while I've been thinking, actually, it'd be really nice just to make something without the noise, without power tools. But, you know, I do definitely feel more connected to the material now, because I understand more about it historically and the hard times it's going through now. But I've also used it a lot more, you know, over the past couple of years. And in the past day making this, I feel incredibly connected to these pieces of wood that a day ago was, you know, just a log. And every commission that comes in and every speculative piece that we make gives me enormous joy. I really enjoy making it. Quite often you get quite attached to pieces, and it's sort of slightly sad to see them go. But when you hear or you know, see photographs of them in the home, in their new resting place, then that fills me with joy. And in terms of going forward, I'd just like that to keep happening more often.
I have so many stories that I could tell you from way up here, for I've looked down on all of your glories, all of your fights and fortunes and tears. I wear my shadows proudly, waiting for the sun to rise, then fall down to the ground before me. But I'm here, not as safe as I seem. I'm lost in a bad dream, and I back to the ground before me.
It's not just a case of putting everything on the consumer saying you must buy more things made of ash. We need to make it available for them to buy. It's building the network of communities throughout the entire supply chain, talking more to each other, building relationships, and hopefully just boosting the whole chain, really.